Eleanor Fairfax Ashworth did not scream when the packet was set on the coverlet beside her. She did not weep. She did not ask the girl holding it to take it away again, though the girl's hands were shaking badly enough that the wax seal rattled against the paper like something alive. She was in the second hour of a labour that would run to 11, and the pain had a rhythm now. A tide she had learnt to ride rather than fight, and when it receded enough to let her think she reached out one hand, not for the packet, not yet, but for the ring on her right hand, the plain silver band with its single dark stone, and she turned it once against her finger to be sure it still sat the way it had sat for 2 years. Stone inward, toward the palm, toward duty. Then she asked Mrs. Dunmore to read it to her, because her own eyes were swimming, and because she had decided, somewhere in the last contraction, that whatever this was, she would not let it arrive in her life, unread and unnamed, the way so much else in this marriage had. Mrs. Dunmore read it in the flat voice of a woman who delivers other people's children for a living, and has therefore trained herself out of surprise. A petition. A suit for annulment filed that week in the name of Julian Ashworth, Duke of Rothburn, on grounds of infidelity alleged and soon to be proved. A directive, courteous in its wording, and merciless in its intent, that the Duchess remove herself from Rothmere Hall within the fortnight, to whatever property she preferred, pending the court's decision. A line, near the bottom, that Eleanor would carry for a long time afterward the way a person carries a stone in a shoe, walking around it without ever quite stopping to remove it. This is not cruelty, Eleanor. It is correction, and correction, unlike cruelty, is meant kindly. She breathed through the next pain before she answered. "Send for the vicar," she said. "Tonight before dawn, if the child comes before then." Mrs. Dunmore's eyebrows rose. "For christening, your Grace? The child isn't born yet. He will be," Eleanor said, "and when he is, I want Reverend Aldous in this room with the register before the sun is up." She turned the ring once more. "The Duke has decided today what my son's name will not be to him. I have decided what it will be to everyone else." By the time the bells of Ashbury rang for evening service the next day, she would have given her son a name no court in England could quietly erase, and she would be gone from Rothmere before her husband's letter of correction had finished drying its ink in whatever London club he had written it from. The spring of 1819 had come to Rothmere the way most things came to that house in those years, announced by paperwork, and late. Eleanor had married Julian Ashworth 2 years before that, in a ceremony her aunt had called sensible, and her own dead father, had he lived to see it, would likely have called sound, in the way he called a ledger sound, the sums correct, the risk understood, nothing left to hope. Julian needed a wife who could run an estate without draining it. Eleanor needed a home that was not her aunt's borrowed parlour, and a purpose larger than embroidery. They had signed the registers within a month of the introduction, and if there was no great tenderness in it, there was no great deception either. Both of them had gone in with clear eyes and closed accounts. What Eleanor had not expected was how much of herself she would pour into a marriage that never once thanked her for the pouring. She managed the household ledgers within her first season, quietly, without announcement, correcting an error in the tenant rents that had been compounding for 6 years before anyone noticed the numbers had drifted. She learnt every family on the Rothmere land by name within the first winter, not their surnames only, but their children's ages, their debts, their small griefs, and she carried that knowledge the way her father had once carried the particular knowledge of a magistrate, filed and ready, and never displayed for its own sake. She worked alongside the land steward, a plain, careful man named Thomas Reeve, on drainage schemes and rent structures that saved the estate more in 3 years than the dowry had brought it in 1. None of it made the newspapers. None of it made her husband's face soften at supper. Julian was not cruel to her in those years. That was, she came to understand, the particular cruelty of him, that he was never cruel, only correct, and correctness left no mark a physician could point to. He was polite at breakfast. He was scrupulous about her allowance. He asked, always, whether the household wanted for anything, and never once asked what she wanted. He had a habit, when she spoke of estate matters at any length, of nodding once, briskly, the way a man nods at a report he trusts enough not to read closely. And there was something in that nod, some particular deftness dressed as respect, that told her more clearly than any argument could have that he had catalogued her long ago and closed the file. She heard him say as much, 3 months before the birth, through a door he had not troubled to close all the way. His grandmother, the Dowager Duchess, a woman built out of plain speech the way other women were built out of lace, had asked him, bluntly, the way she asked everything, why he seemed to stand so far from a wife great with his own child. "She is suitable," Julian had said, in the voice he used for tenant disputes, level and closed. "She keeps the ledgers straight and the tenants content. I did not marry her to be loved, grandmother. I married her to be spared foolishness." Eleanor had stood in the corridor with one hand flat against the wall, and had not gone in. She had counted instead a habit she had built for herself in the first year of the marriage, and never told anyone about, 15 minutes, timed against the case clock at the end of the hall, in which she allowed herself to feel the full weight of the sentence. At the end of 15 minutes she had gone to check the dairy accounts, because the accounts did not care what she had overheard, and because her father had taught her, before he died with his own ledgers balanced to the penny, that a woman who kept her books straight could survive almost anything that happened around them. She had not known, standing in that corridor, that the sentence she'd overheard was not the worst thing her husband would say about her that year. She had not known about the letters already moving between London and Rothmere in a hand made to look like hers, or about the cousin who had commissioned them, or about the particular arithmetic of fear that would lead a careful man to burn down his own house, rather than risk being made a fool of in it twice. She only knew, standing there with her palm against cool plaster, and her son not yet 3 months from arriving, that she had been classified. Suitable, useful, not loved. She went back to the dairy accounts. The numbers, at least, had never once looked at her, and found her merely adequate. The letter that started it all had come to Julian in London on a wet Tuesday in February, delivered by his cousin Alistair Vance, with the particular gentleness of a man handing over bad news he has personally arranged. Alistair was next in line for the dukedom should Julian die without an heir, a fact that had never troubled anyone until Eleanor's condition became visible, at which point it had begun to trouble Alistair a very great deal. He was a smooth man, warm in company, generous with his laughter, the sort the county called easy and meant it as praise. He had spent 11 months cultivating a servant discharged from Rothmere for petty theft, a young woman named Peg Simmons, bitter and frightened and badly in need of money, and had spent a further 2 months practising a forgery of Eleanor's careful, upright hand, until 3 letters existed that no expert eye had yet examined closely enough to doubt. The letters were addressed, ostensibly, from the Duchess to Thomas Reeve, the land steward, and they were not letters a wife writes to a man she works with on drainage schemes. Julian read them twice in his club, in a private room he had taken for the purpose, and did not sleep that night, and did not write to his wife to ask her a single question. He wrote instead to his solicitor. That was the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic he dislikes and has decided, out of an old and well-worn fear, not to check. Alistair had understood something true about his cousin, which was that a boy abandoned by his mother at 7 years old, raised afterward by a father who taught him that love was a door women walked out of and duty was the only door that stayed shut, would not confront a suspected betrayal. He would file it, correct it, and remove himself from the room before it could hurt him twice. He was right. Julian filed the suit within the week, and drafted the letter himself, in the flat, considered language of a man who believes he is behaving well, and sent it by express rider to arrive at Rothmere at the earliest possible date, a date that happened, through no calculation of his and every calculation of the child's own timing, to be the same day his son chose to be born. He did not know that yet. He was in London, closing the account, the way he closed everything. Eleanor was at Rothmere, opening one. The child came at 4 a.m, red-faced and furious and enormous of lung, and Eleanor held him for exactly 4 minutes before she asked Mrs. Dunmore to send the girl for Reverend Aldis, who arrived within the half-hour in his nightshirt under his coat, blinking and unbrushed, and entirely unprepared for what the Duchess of Rothburn intended to ask of him before sunrise. "You wish him christened now?" the vicar said carefully. "Tonight, this morning," Eleanor said. She was sitting up against the pillows, pale and steady, the boy wrapped and quiet against her arm. "Before the household wakes properly, before anyone can tell me it is improper, or premature, or unnecessary." "May I ask why, Your Grace?" "Because in 6 hours a rider will come from London with a document that would have my husband's family believe this child has no name to inherit," Eleanor said, "and I would like the parish register to disagree with him before he arrives." Aldis looked at Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, who had come up with fresh linens and stopped dead in the doorway at the sight of the register already open on the writing-table, the ink already uncapped. "Name him," Aldis said at last, quietly, "and I will write it." Eleanor looked down at the child. She thought, distantly, that she had expected to feel something enormous in this moment, some flood that would finally break the 15-minute ration she had been living on for 2 years, and instead she felt something colder and clearer than grief, something closer to the particular calm of a woman closing a ledger she has checked 3 times and knows to be correct. "Nathaniel," she said. "Nathaniel Julian Ashworth." Mrs. Pruitt made a small sound and pressed her knuckles to her mouth. "You would give him the Duke's own Christian name," Aldis said, not quite a question. "I would give him everything that is legitimately his," Eleanor said, "including a father's name, whether or not that father has yet decided to earn it." "Write it, Reverend. I want witnesses. I want the date exact. I want it done before the household breakfast bell, and I want you to know, so that you may say so honestly to anyone who asks, that I asked for this with a clear head and a quiet voice, at 4 hours old and no older." He wrote it. Mrs. Pruitt and Mrs. Dunmore signed as witnesses, their hands not quite steady, and the boy slept through the whole of his own christening, which Eleanor would later think was exactly right, since he had done nothing yet to deserve the war being fought over his name, and would do nothing to deserve it for years to come. When it was done, she allowed herself 15 minutes by the mantel clock, the old ration, doubled for the occasion, to grieve the marriage as it had stood that morning, the 2 years of careful competence that had bought her nothing. The sentence overheard through a half-shut door, the packet on the coverlet. At the end of the 15 minutes she wiped her face once, with the flat of her hand, the way a woman wipes a slate, and said to Mrs. Pruitt, "I will want the small trunk packed, not the good one. My father's old lap desk, my own clothes, the boys' things. We will go to my aunt's at Willowmere before the rider returns." "Your Grace, I have work to do, Mrs. Pruitt," Eleanor said, and there was nothing dramatic in the way she said it. It was the same voice she used for tenant rents. I find that clarifies most things. Willowmere was 11 miles from Rothmere, a low stone house with 40 acres of indifferent pasture and 1 good orchard, left to Eleanor's father by an uncle, and passed, since his death, into the keeping of her aunt Ruth Fairfax, a spinster of sharp opinions and a genuinely kind heart who had not expected, at 51, to become nursemaid to a duchess and a duke's infant son on 4 days' notice. She managed it without complaint, which was, Eleanor thought, within the first week, the particular gift of women who have spent their lives being underestimated. They know exactly how much can be done quietly. The trouble was money, and land gone soft with neglect, and a bailiff who had been cheating the estate in small increments for years because no one had ever checked his figures against the actual yield of the orchard. Eleanor checked them within a fortnight. She sat at her father's old lap desk with Nathaniel asleep in a basket at her feet, and went through 6 years of accounts the way she had once gone through Rothmere's rent ledgers, and found the drift within 3 evenings, and dismissed the bailiff herself, calmly, across her aunt's kitchen table, while the man blustered about a duchess who thought she understood farming. "I understand numbers," Eleanor told him. "Numbers do not care whether I have ever mucked a stall. Yours do not add. Good day." Word of that got round the village of Ashbury faster than she expected. And not kindly at first, a great lady turned out of her husband's house, playing at farming, was exactly the kind of story that improved with retelling. But the orchard yielded better that autumn than it had in 5 years, and the 2 tenant families on Willowmere's land found their rents fairly assessed for the first time in memory. And by harvest the story in the village had changed its shape, without anyone quite noticing the seam. Thomas Reeve rode over from Rothmere twice that first season, ostensibly to consult her on a drainage question no one else on the estate could answer, and stayed each time long enough to see how she worked, sleeves pushed back, ledger open, questions sharp and few, and rode back to Rothmere both times looking, the second visit, faintly troubled. He said as much to the Dowager Duchess, who had summoned him for tea and information in roughly equal measure. "She has turned that farm around in a season," Reeve said. "On her own account, mind, not a shilling from the Duke, and she wouldn't take one if he offered." "He will not offer," the Dowager said, dry as a page turned once too often. "He is too busy being correct. Begging your pardon, your Grace, but he ought to see it. What she's built out there." "He will," the Dowager said, and there was something in the way she said it. Patient, certain, faintly grim, that made Reeve understand the old woman had been waiting a long time for her grandson to be wrong about something in a manner he could not correct his way out of. It happened sooner than either of them expected, and not because Julian went looking for the truth. It happened because the truth, once someone finally checked it, had never been difficult to find. The suit had stalled in the ecclesiastical courts through the summer, as such suits do, mired in procedure, and in the stalling Julian had time, more time than a man wants, when the thing he is avoiding is his own certainty, to hear reports. Reeves, carried unwillingly. The dowagers, carried with relish. A note from Reverend Aldis, formally informing His Grace that the child had been christened Nathaniel Julian Ashworth on the morning of his birth, with the date and witnesses recorded, as the law required him to inform the family of any christening within the parish. Julian read that note 4 times. He had expected, if he expected anything, that his wife would give the boy her own name, or no name at all, or wait, some gesture that matched the shape of a woman being wronged. He had not expected her to hand the child, unasked, the very name Julian himself had been trying to strip from him. He found he could not stop thinking about it. That was the particular stillness of a man discovering that his own certainty has developed a crack he cannot see the bottom of. He came to Willamere in September, unannounced, on a grey afternoon that smelled of rain not yet fallen, and found his wife in the orchard with a ledger balanced on a fence rail, and their son, 5 months old now, sturdy and loud, propped in a basket in the grass beside her, gnawing on a wooden spoon, with tremendous seriousness. Eleanor saw him from 30 feet away, and did not startle. She closed the ledger. "Your Grace," she said. "Eleanor," he stood at the gate, hat in his hands, and did not come through it. "I heard about the christening. I imagined you would, eventually. You gave him my name." "I gave him his name," Eleanor said. "It happens to be yours as well. That was not a courtesy to you, Julian, whatever you decide to make of it. It was an itemized fact. He is your son, born within your marriage, before any court had ruled otherwise, and I was not going to let a rumour arrive at his life before the truth did." He was quiet for a moment. Nathaniel dropped the spoon and complained about it loudly, and Eleanor bent, unhurried, to retrieve it, and in the small, ordinary motion of that, a mother picking a spoon up off the grass, while a duke stood frozen at a gate he had not opened, something in Julian's face did something Eleanor had not seen it do in 2 years of marriage. "May I see him?" Julian said. It was not quite a question. "You may open the gate," Eleanor said. "I've never locked it." He came through, slowly, and crouched beside the basket at a careful distance, the way a man approaches something he is afraid of loving. Nathaniel regarded him with the frank suspicion of infants everywhere, and then, entirely without ceremony, seized one of his father's fingers and put it directly in his mouth. Julian went very still. "He does that to everyone," Eleanor said. "It is not an endorsement." "No," Julian said, and something that was almost a laugh moved through his voice and died before it fully arrived. "No, I don't imagine it is." He stayed an hour. He asked stiffly about the orchard, and Eleanor told him plainly what she had found in the old bailiff's books and what she had done about it. And he listened. Actually listened, the way he had not listened at Rothmere's supper table in 2 years, without the brisk closing nod, and when he finally rose to go he stood at the gate again, with his hat in his hands, and said, "The suit is not withdrawn." "I did not imagine it was," Eleanor said. "You did not ride 11 miles to withdraw a suit, Julian. Men who mean to withdraw something send a letter. I don't know what I rode here to do. Then I will tell you what I require, since you seem unsure." She came to stand at the gate herself, the ledger under one arm, entirely composed, entirely unhurried. "I do not want an apology tonight. An apology is easy. Any man can be sorry in a doorway with his hat in his hands. I want to know why. And I do not want the why in words only. Words are cheap, Julian, and you have always been a careful spender of everything except them. Show me. Not tonight. Over time. Come back when you have something besides remorse to bring, and I will decide then what I think it is worth." He looked at her for a long moment, and at the boy in the grass, and at the ring on her hand, which she had not stopped wearing, stone still turned inward. "I will come back," he said. "I know," Eleanor said. That was never the question. He turned it in his hand once, the plain silver band she still wore stone inward against her palm, the ring his grandmother had pressed into her fingers the morning of the wedding, with a warning Eleanor had not understood until much later. "It is not a gift from him," the dowager had said then. "It is a judgment on him if he fails you. Wear the stone toward your palm while it is a marriage of duty. You will know, if you ever wear it the other way, that it has become something else. Do not turn it for anyone, Eleanor, until you mean it." Julian did not ask about the ring that afternoon. He rode away instead with the print of his son's grip still faint against his finger, and Eleanor went back to her ledger. And neither of them said the thing that both of them had begun, in that hour, to suspect, that the suit filed in February had been built on paper that would not survive daylight, if anyone troubled to hold it up to it. Someone finally did, in October, and the someone was Thomas Reeve, going through his own travel accounts for the quarter and noticing, with the particular cold clarity of a careful man finding an error in his own careful work, that the dates on which the forged letters claimed he had met the Duchess in private did not match a single day he could account for. He had been in Denholt on 3 of those dates, at the Corn Exchange, with a dozen witnesses and a signed receipt for seed grain to prove it. He rode to Willowmere with the receipts in his coat pocket and his hat crushed in his hand from nervous handling. "I don't know what these letters say precisely, Your Grace," he said, laying the dates out on Eleanor's kitchen table like a man laying out evidence at his own trial. "I've not seen them. But whatever they claim happened between us, on these 3 days, it did not happen, because I was 40 miles away buying seed corn, and I can prove it 11 ways." Eleanor looked at the dates for a long time. "Then we will need the letters themselves," she said finally, "and someone who can tell forged ink from honest ink, and I believe I know exactly the man for it." The man was Mr. Kettering, a solicitor in Denholt, with a reputation for precision so exacting that even his enemies trusted his opinion once he'd given it, and Eleanor wrote to him herself, plainly, laying out what she suspected and what she could already prove, and asking him to examine 3 letters that were, at that point, still in the Duke's possession and part of an active suit. Which meant the first document she needed was not evidence at all, but an invitation. She sent it to Julian with no flourish. "I believe the letters you hold are false, and I believe I can show you why, if you will bring them to Denholt and let a disinterested man examine them in both our presence. I am not asking you to trust me. I am asking you to trust arithmetic." He came within the week, the letters sealed in a leather case, and sat across a table from his wife in Kettering's narrow office, while the solicitor turned the pages toward the window light with a glass in his hand, silent for a long time, in the particular way of a man who has already seen the answer and is checking it a second time out of professional habit rather than doubt. "The hand is a close copy," Kettering said finally, "close enough to fool a man reading in poor light with his mind already made up. It is not close enough to fool ink. Your Grace's genuine correspondence," he nodded at a bundle Eleanor had brought, household letters spanning 2 years, dated and witnessed, is written in an iron gall ink mixed, if I don't miss my guess, by the stationer in Ashbury Village, who uses a formula heavier in oak gall than most. These 3 letters are written in a London mixed ink, thinner, faster drying. The Duchess has not been to London in 11 months. Julian did not speak. He was looking at the 3 letters spread on the table, the way a man looks at a bridge he has just been told he crossed over open water. "There is also the matter of dates," Eleanor said quietly, and set Reeve's travel receipts beside the letters. 2 of the 3 claimed meetings occurred on days Mr. Reeve was in Denholt on estate business, with witnesses to prove it. "I would be glad to produce those witnesses at your convenience." "Who?" Julian said, and his voice had gone very flat, very controlled, in the way of a man holding something together by main force. "Who delivered these to me?" "That," Eleanor said, "is a question you will have to answer for yourself, Julian. I have given you the how. I will not give you the who as a gift. You will have to go and find it, the way I found mine." He found it within the fortnight, and it was not difficult once he began asking with his certainty gone, rather than his certainty intact. Peg Simmons, the discharged maid, broke within a single conversation with Reeve, who went to her not as an accuser, but as a man, asking a plain question plainly, and she wept, genuinely this time, and told him everything. The money, the practised hand, the cousin who had visited her twice a month with instructions, and left the second time with a warning about what would happen to her situation if she ever spoke of it. Alistair Vance, informed by no one that his scheme had unravelled, continued through the autumn to press the ecclesiastical court for a swift hearing, confident that a duke too proud to admit his own error would rather see the suit through than confess he had filed it on forged evidence. He was wrong about his cousin's pride. He had never fully understood, in 11 months of careful planning, that the man he was manipulating had spent his whole life being taught that pride was cheaper than honesty, and had, in a stone cottage 11 miles from Rothmere, finally begun to unlearn it. The hearing that Alistair had pressed for came in November, at the county assizes in Denholt, before a magistrate and a public gallery that had, by then, heard enough fragments of the story second-hand to fill the room 3 rows deep. Eleanor arrived with Kettering's report bound in leather, Reeve's travel receipts in order by date, and Peg Simmons seated beside her Aunt Ruth in the second row, pale but present, having agreed, of her own choice, once promised she would not be prosecuted for the forgery itself, to speak the truth aloud in a room full of people who had every reason to doubt a discharged servant's word. Alistair sat near the front in a coat too fine for the occasion, smiling the particular warm smile of a man who has decided, against all evidence, that confidence alone can carry a case. The magistrate called the matter to order, and Eleanor stood. She did not raise her voice. She had never needed to. She laid the letters and the ink analysis before the bench first plainly, and invited the magistrate to examine them himself before she said another word. "I would rather you trust your own eyes than my account of them," and then called Reeve, who spoke his dates and his receipts in the flat, unadorned voice of a man, with nothing to hide and everything to lose by inventing anything, and then called Peg. Peg's hands shook so badly on the rail that Ruth Fairfax rose without asking anyone's permission and stood beside her, one hand steady at her elbow, and the room, which had come expecting a spectacle, went very quiet at the sight of an old spinster standing by a frightened maid, the way a person stands by someone they've decided is worth defending. "He paid me £11, Peg said, when she found her voice. "Over 4 visits. He brought a copy of a letter he said was the Duchess's hand, and told me to practice it till my own writing near disappeared under it. He told me if I didn't, he'd see me transported for the theft I'd already been let off for quiet-like. I did it because I was afraid, and because £11 was more money than I'd seen in my life, and I am sorrier for it than I have words to say. But I will not lie again to save myself the shame of having lied once." Alistair rose to object, smoothly, warmly, and it was in that rising, in the particular practised calm of a man performing innocence rather than possessing it, that something in the gallery's mood finally, audibly, turned. A murmur went through the room, low and cold, the way a tide turns before anyone has consciously noticed the water has begun to pull back. The magistrate called for the original correspondence Alistair had once sent Peg with instructions, produced by Reeve, who had recovered 2 surviving notes from her lodgings, and set them beside Alistair's own known hand from a letter to the county assessor filed years before. And there was no ink expert needed, in the end, for that comparison. The room could see it plainly enough on its own. Alistair Vance's face, which had held its warm and confident shape through the letters, and through Reeve's dates, and even through Peg's trembling testimony, finally lost it there, in full public view, and something behind his composure visibly went out, like a lamp starved of oil. The magistrate dismissed the suit within the hour, on the grounds that the evidence supporting it was demonstrably fraudulent, and the marriage of Julian Ashworth, Duke of Rothburn, and Eleanor Fairfax Ashworth, Duchess of Rothburn, stood exactly where it had always legally stood, intact, unbroken, whatever else had been broken around it. It was Eleanor who spoke next, before the room could disperse into gossip, asking the magistrate's leave to say one further thing. "I could ask that my husband's cousin be prosecuted for the forgery," she said, "and I believe the evidence would support it fully. I am not going to ask that." She looked, briefly, at Alistair, whose smile was entirely gone now, whose hands were flat and still on the rail in front of him. "I have a son who will one day inherit a family name, and I would rather he inherit a family that knows how to be merciful from a position of strength than one that only knows how to punish from a position of fear. Mr. Vance will relinquish any claim to succession he has pressed improperly, and he will remove himself from this county within the month, and he will not, for the rest of his natural life, come within a mile of Rothmere or Willowmere or any child of mine. That is not leniency, Mr. Vance. That is a cost. I would ask you to understand the difference, since you have spent a great deal of effort failing to understand simpler things." The room did not applaud. It was not that sort of room. But the silence that followed had a different weight to it than the silence that had opened the hearing, and Julian, seated near the front, with his hands clasped so tightly the knuckles had gone white, understood that his wife had just done, in 11 minutes, more to restore the family's name than he had managed to do to it harm in 11 months. He came to her afterward in the corridor outside the courtroom, and for the first time in 2 years of marriage he did not stand at a careful distance with his hat in his hands. "I owe you an explanation," he said, "not an apology. You told me once those were different things, and I did not understand you then. I do now." "Then say it," Eleanor said. "All of it. I have time," he told her, there in the cold stone corridor, with the gallery still emptying past them, about a woman who had left when he was 7, without a note his father ever let him read, and a father who had raised him afterward on the doctrine that love was a door women walked through going out, and that the only safe thing to build a life on was usefulness, because usefulness, unlike love, could be measured and relied upon, and never simply left. He told her he had read 3 forged letters in a London club, and had not, for one single hour, considered riding home to ask her a plain question. because some deep unexamined part of him had been waiting his whole adult life for the proof that loving a woman was a mistake, and Alistair had simply handed him what he was already braced to receive. "That is the why," he said. "It does not make it forgivable. I am not offering it as an excuse. I am offering it because you asked for the reason, and not merely the regret, and I would rather you have both, ugly as the reason is, than only the second." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. "Thank you," she said finally, "for not making it pretty. Now, I told you at the gate in September that I would decide, over time, what your explanation was worth. I meant that. I am not going to decide it today, in a courthouse corridor, on the strength of one honest confession, however honest. But I will tell you what I require, if there is to be a decision at all. Tell me. Willowmere stays mine, in my name, on my own account, whatever happens between us. I built something there that belongs to no one's mercy but my own. Nathaniel's guardianship is joint, but I will not be asked, ever again, to explain a decision about my own son to a solicitor before I have explained it to his father directly. My work on the Rothmere accounts, if I choose to return to it, is formalised, named, on the books, not absorbed quietly into a wife's unpaid duties the way it was for 2 years. And Alistair Vance is never spoken of in my hearing again, not to excuse him, not to condemn him, not at all. I have finished with him. I will not spend one more sentence of my life on his account. Agreed, Julian said, without hesitation. You did not think about that. I have had 11 months to think about very little else, Eleanor. I am not going to pretend deliberation I don't need. She almost smiled. It did not quite arrive, but it came closer than it had in 2 years, and Julian, watching it not quite happen, felt something in his chest do the particular thing a held breath does when it is finally, cautiously, let go. "All right," she said. "All right, then," he said. And that was the whole treaty. The months that followed were not dramatic. And Eleanor had not expected them to be. Repair, she had learned from her father's ledgers, was never a single grand entry. It was a column of small ones, added up over time until the total meant something. Julian came to Willowmere every week through the winter, then twice a week, and by spring he had taken to riding over, simply to sit in the orchard with Nathaniel on a blanket, while Eleanor worked at her father's lap desk nearby, saying little, learning the particular geography of a child's needs the way he had once learned an estate's, carefully and late, and without complaint about the lateness. He learned which of Nathaniel's cries meant hunger, and which meant simple boredom. He learned to hold a spoon steady enough that it stopped being a target for small, furious fists. None of it was announced. All of it was noticed. He asked her, in March, whether she would consider returning to Rothmere, and did not press when she said not yet, and did not ask again until she raised it herself in May, on her own timing, which was, she told him plainly, the only timing she intended to operate on from that point forward. There was one relapse, in June, that told her more than a year of good behaviour could have. A tenant dispute came up over a boundary hedge, the sort of small, ordinary friction estates produce constantly, and Julian, out of 2 years of old habit, settled it himself, by letter, without consulting her, the way he had settled everything in the first years of their marriage. Eleanor did not shout about it. She set the letter down on the table between them, later when he rode over, and said, "This is the old pattern, Julian. Decide alone. Inform after. I recognise it, because I have lived inside it for 2 years, and it left marks I am still finding. I am not accusing you of the old cruelty. I am naming the old habit, because habits do not care how sorry a man is, they simply repeat, unless someone names them out loud. He was quiet for a long moment, turning his hat in his hands the way he had turned it at the gate the previous September. "You're right," he said. "I did it without thinking, which is worse than doing it deliberately, in its way. I'll write to the tenant again, jointly this time, with your name on the letter alongside mine, and I will try, I cannot promise perfectly, but I will try, to catch myself before the old habit runs, rather than after. That," Eleanor said, "is the correct answer. Not because it is comfortable, because it is honest about how hard it will be." By autumn she had returned to Rothmere, not as a woman restored to a place she had lost, but as a woman who had built her own ground first, and brought it with her. She kept Willowmere in her own name, exactly as she had required, and split her weeks between the two houses for a time, and the tenants of both properties learned to expect her at their doors, with a ledger under her arm and a fair question on her lips, which was, by then, simply understood to be how the Duchess of Rothburn conducted business. Julian said the words, finally, on an ordinary evening in October, in the estate office at Rothmere, with the account books open between them the way they had been open, in one form or another, since the first week of their marriage. "I have been trying to find the right occasion for this," he said, "and I have decided there isn't one, so I will simply say it here, over the rent ledger, since that is where most of what is true between us seems to get said." "Say it, then. I did not marry you to be loved," he said. "I told my grandmother that once, and you heard it, and I have known for a year that you heard it, because you have never once pretended otherwise to spare me. I did not marry you to be spared foolishness either, in the end, though I believed that when I said it. I married you, and then I was the fool, a considerable one, for the better part of a year, and you spared me anyway, when you had every right and every reason not to. I would choose you, Eleanor, not as correction, not as duty. I have been choosing you, in fact, for some time now, in an orchard and a courthouse corridor, and every ordinary Tuesday since. And I find I would like to go on choosing you for a great many more of them if you will let me." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment across the ledger, and then, without a word, reached down and turned the ring on her right hand, slowly, deliberately, the stone travelling from the inside of her palm to the outside, where anyone looking could see it. "I have been waiting to know I meant it before I did that," she said. "I mean it now." Julian's breath left him unevenly, and he reached across the desk and covered her hand with the ring warm between their palms, and neither of them said anything else for a long moment, because there are agreements that do not require more words than that. 2 years later, in the summer of 1822, the house at Rothmere no longer held its breath the way it once had. Nathaniel, 3 years old and loud in exactly the manner his mother had once been quiet, ran the length of the long gallery with a wooden spoon still, somehow, his favourite implement, while his father chased him half-heartedly and lost on purpose, and the Dowager Duchess watched from her chair by the window with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has waited a long time to be right about someone. Willowmere still stood in Eleanor's name alone, its orchard yielding better every year, its accounts kept, still, in her father's old careful method, the ledger open on a fresh page each January, with the same line written at the top, in her own steady hand. A ledger does not lie, even when people do. Thomas Reeve managed both estates now, formally, with a salary the equal of any stewards in the county, and a small share in the land besides, because Eleanor had insisted, when the terms were drawn, that a man who had ridden into a courtroom with his own travel receipts to defend a truth that cost him nothing to ignore deserved more than gratitude. She had made it policy, that year, that every tenant and every servant on both properties be paid a fair, published wage, posted openly on the estate room door, where any man could check it against his own pay, and find no discrepancy, not a favour. She told Julian when he asked why she'd bothered to make it public rather than simply fair. But proof. A house that has nothing to hide should never act as though it does. Peg Simmons, given a second chance no one had required Eleanor to give her, kept house now for Ruth Fairfax at Willowmere, and had in 2 years never once been late with a wage or short with the truth. The ring on Eleanor's hand still sat stone outward, and it caught the light, that summer evening, as she stood in the doorway of the long gallery watching her husband lose, on purpose, to a boy with a spoon. She had stopped, somewhere in those 2 years, asking to be seen. She had made herself, instead, impossible to unsee, not by raising her voice, not by demanding it, but by keeping her accounts straight, her word exact, and her composure whole through every season. A lesser woman might have been forgiven for losing it. That was not the same as being loved. It had simply, in the end, made loving her impossible to avoid, not because she had finally become worth something she had not been before, but because the people around her had finally learned to read what had been true the entire time. A woman is not made valuable by being noticed. She is only, at last, correctly accounted for. And what is correctly accounted for, once written down in a hand that does not lie, can never again be quietly erased.